All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 28, Section 3, Peace and Dislocation in Europe, 1919 to 1929. So this section is talking about the consequences or the impact of the war. And again, the war that we are referring to here is World War One. Now, World War I was the deadliest war to date, between 9 and 10 million deaths, mostly combat deaths. So people, yes, mostly young men who were in the military, people who had enlisted or were conscripted. The consequences of the war were also different in the psychological effects that it had on people, something that really wasn't at least as well known or prevalent until World War I was shell shock. We might also call this something like PTSD if you're familiar with the kind of modern definition or term for it. And this was psychological. Soldiers who had experienced the war who could not stop shaking. Mentally, they were broken down. World War I was an especially brutal war in that respect. There were deadlier wars, but the type of warfare that was involved, sitting in a trench for a very long period of time, it was the first war in which you were killed and never saw your enemy. That had never really taken place on a battlefield before World War I due to the technology. So the sort of constant fear that at any moment an artillery shell could fall on one's head created, a great psychological damage on those who experienced it. Additionally, there were, due to the territorial changes and new countries that were created, millions of refugees seeking new homes. So refugees are people who are displaced by the war. And this occurred in, Germany, Russia, the Ottoman Empire. And then following the war, there was also an influenza epidemic, or the Spanish flu, as it's sometimes referred to. The war had created a lot more interconnectedness. And this was a flu, kind of like, today, COVID-19, that spread among soldiers and spread to a lot of different parts of the world due to the interconnectedness of the war. And in terms of just death count, it was deadlier than the war itself. Anywhere between 10 and 20 million people died of the Spanish flu, or the influenza epidemic. 1918 to 1919 is when it occurred, right at the end of the war. Now, in terms of the post-war settlement and the peace treaty for the war, the nations met in Paris. It was called the Paris Peace Conference. And the representatives there included Woodrow Wilson from the United States, David Lloyd George from Great Britain, and Georges Clemenceau from France. Now, these were among the Allied powers. Now, recall, Russia had been amongst the Allies, but Russia went through a revolution, which we talked about last section, 28.2. So Russia's not there. Instead, Russia in many ways is replaced by the United States, who joined the war late in 1917 on the side of the Allies and emerged victorious. We call these sometimes the Big Three, and for the most part, they dictated peace terms. Now, they didn't all agree with one another. So, for example, Woodrow Wilson and the U.S. wanted 14 points, which was much more of an idealistic vision for what the war would create. In the United States, World War I was supposedly the war to make the world safe for democracy. Britain and France, they wanted more concrete concessions. They wanted, especially France, wanted revenge. This was not about building a better world. For Britain and France, this was about making Germany pay for what they did, and France to get revenge on Germany for attacking them in this particular conflict. At the Paris Peace Conference, there was tremendous disappointment. Many nations and many organizations came away from the peace conference not getting what they want. We talked about some of these countries and groups of people before, but we can add to the list. Italy didn't get what they want, even though they were on the side of the Allies. Japan didn't get what they want. Pretty much the prejudice and racist views of Some of these nations didn't give Japan maybe their fair share. The Pan-African Congress, which spoke on behalf of all people of African descent in the New World and in Africa, Arabs and Zionists, right? The Arabs and Zionists playing in the Ottoman Empire. For Woodrow Wilson, what did the 14 points include? Well, again, there are 14 things, but really the only two that you need to know. Self-determination. Self-determination is the, we'll say self-determination is the ability for a nation, to rule themselves. And so this was Wilson's idea that if every single group of people just ruled themselves, then there would be peace and harmony. A lot of the reason as to why World War I broke out was, or at least the origins of it, was the fact that Austria-Hungary had ruled over Slavic nationalists or Serbians, and the Serbians or Serbian nationalists assassinated the Archduke in an effort to try to break free from Austrian rule. Of course, Woodrow Wilson believes that if everybody just kind of ruled themselves, then there would be peace. Again, think about this as being very idealistic. Another thing was to create an international government to keep peace. The League of Nations, an international, in fact, the first, right, we'll say first, international organization dedicated to peace. The idea is that, well, if something, this war was a war between nations. It was a war between France and Britain and Russia and Germany and Italy, etc., etc. If there was some sort of organization that included all the nations that could help settle disputes and prevent war from ever happening again, well, that would be ideal. And so the League of Nations was created. A couple of points about the League of Nations that ultimately leads to its downfall. Even though this was Wilson's idea, the U.S. was not a member. The U.S. Senate rejected U.S. participation in the League of Nations, and it has no armed force. And so while it's very idealistic and maybe well-intentioned, if there's no ability to enforce the peace, this is kind of a, I don't know if it's irony, right? But you can't have peace unless you're willing to enforce it with some sort of armed conflict, right? The League of Nations didn't have any armed force, and these are reasons why it'll ultimately fail. But it was created in kind of the sense of optimism of the era that this was, in fact, the war to end all wars. What eventually came out of the Paris Peace Conference was the Treaty of Versailles. This was the treaty for Germany. And for the most part, when we look at the Treaty of Versailles and kind of the competing ideas, we would probably say that it was the British and the French that kind of came out on top, because this treaty ends up making Germany pay for the war, and in some ways France gets its revenge. As a condition of the war, Germany must have a limited army. It cannot build up a big army and have no air force. It's banned from having an air force. Germany loses territory, including colonies. So Germany loses all of its colonies, plus France claims German territory. This was actually territory that was lost by France, Alsace and Lorraine. This was land that was lost to Germany during the Franco-Prussian War. France reclaims that. The Germans also lose territory to a lot of new countries that are created. We talked about them in a previous section. So, for example, the country of Poland is created. A lot of former German territory now goes to that state. Germany is forced to pay reparations, again, quite literally, pay for the war, and to kind of rub salt in the wound, the war guilt clause, which blames Germany for the war. Now, us, looking back on it, we know today that Germany is not 100% responsible. They do share some responsibility, but so too do other nations. And the topic of who is to blame for World War I will, forever be argued. But to say that Germany was 100% responsible for the war, we know that now not to be the case. So, for the most part, these were generally perceived as being very strict conditions. One thing that made the Paris Peace Conference different from peace conferences historically was that the defeated powers weren't invited. Germany was more or less given this as an ultimatum. It was a dictated peace in a lot of ways, not a negotiated peace. Meanwhile, in Russia, like we mentioned before, Russia is not at the Paris Peace Conference because they're going through a revolution. Once the Bolsheviks successfully assume power, they are then forced to fight all of the other factions in Russia. The Russian Civil War is essentially the Bolsheviks. We'll say Russian Civil War. It is the Bolsheviks, which again are led by Lenin. They are the communists. And they're fighting against pretty much a lot of different factions. They're fighting against those that are still loyal to the Tsar, even though the Tsar was executed by the Bolsheviks. They're fighting those who want democracy. They're fighting the Western powers, so even countries like the United States don't want to see the Bolsheviks win. They are fighting other less extreme communists. But the one thing that the Bolsheviks have in their favor during the Russian Civil War is that none of these are really fighting together. And so they eventually defeat all their enemies, emerge victorious from the Russian Civil War, establish the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Again, we no longer refer to Russia as Russia, but we refer to it as the USSR. This includes Russia plus areas like Ukraine, Armenia, and a bunch of other quote-unquote, socialist republics that make part of this much larger entity. Now, given all of Russia's history up until this point, the economy is in shambles. And so the new economic policy, this is a policy to allow capitalism to fix the economy. Now, this was very controversial. We'll say among the Bolsheviks. Again, recall, the Bolsheviks are leading this revolution to establish a communist state. Communism is anti-capitalism, but Lenin, realizing that the Soviet Union is in no position to begin this process of a state-run economy, because Russia's just gone through 2 revolutions, a world war, a civil war, and that causes a lot of economic disruption. So this was meant to be like to give the Russian state, or at least at this point the Soviet Union, give it a little bit of a breather, have the economy recover a little bit, allow people to individually make their economic decisions, and then after that point, initiate the state-run economy. This was, again, like I said, controversial among some Bolsheviks. Lenin eventually died in the 1920s. This is Lenin right here. And that left a power vacuum. And there were 2 people looking to fill Lenin's place, Trotsky and Stalin. Trotsky was leader of the Red Army. Stalin was the secretary. And Stalin, because he worked with the sort of paperwork of the Communist Party, he was well connected. He pretty much knew everything about everybody. He eventually beat out Trotsky, who was forced into exile and later killed by Joseph Stalin. And when Stalin assumed control, and this was, maybe 1920s, late 1920s was when Stalin finally came to power, Russia was in such poor shape, you might say, that instead of looking for a communist revolution around the world, Joseph Stalin instead focused on what he called communism in one country, and that is to focus only on the Soviet Union. Again, the goal of communism is to overthrow capitalism across the world. Remember Karl Marx said, workers of the world unite. Joseph Stalin, upon coming to power in the 1920s after Lenin had died, said, no, it's going to be communism in one country, focus only on the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in Germany, things were going pretty badly. In order to pay reparations, remember, Germany was forced to pay reparations from the Treaty of Versailles. The German state resulted in printing money. That money led to hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is the value of the currency. In this case, I think it was the mark. I think that's what the Germans use. But the value of the currency goes down. In fact, it was so bad in Germany that people, the currency was so devalued that people would rather burn their money in the furnace because that would produce heat than spend it because it was pretty much, worthless. And in order to make sure that chaos didn't break out in Germany, the United States, which emerged as really the only, the United States emerged out of World War I in a very strong position. Again, the United States was not involved in the war from the beginning, but made loans and built war-related products, which they profited from. Eventually, the United States sent loans to Germany so that it could continue to pay its reparations. And so this created a very kind of uneasy and unstable global economic situation, because here you have France and Britain. Right? Now recall that France and Britain borrowed a lot of money from the US during the war. So France and Britain are currently paying back their debts to the United States. Germany, because they lost the war, is forced to pay back France, Britain, and the United States for the cost, but mostly Britain and France. And so the United States becoming this lifeline creates an interconnectedness of the economy that once when we get to a later chapter here, we'll learn. Let's do it in green. Green is for money. Right, so this becomes sort of an interconnected economy. And then, of course, you could connect pretty much every other aspect of the economy to this, right? So you look at France's colonies, they're connected to this. Britain's colonies are also connected to this, including India. The United States, who for the most part trades with pretty much everybody, including Latin America. Right, and we'll learn in a later chapter that when one part of this economy goes bad, i.e. the United States, it's going to create a very bad problem for the world. So we might say, and again, hyperinflation, this is happening in Germany, just keep that in mind. We might say of the war debt cycle created, and we'll say just an we'll just say an unstable economy, right? So this is very much fragile, right? Very much fragile. That, the war debt cycle, combined with the inability of the League of Nations, we'll talk more about their failures in another chapter, but again, the whole purpose of the League of Nations is to keep peace. It's the economic problems plus a weak League of Nations, right? We can put these things together. So we'll say economic problems plus a weak League of Nations, which ultimately becomes the major causes to the Second World War.